Alright, so here we are. We're about to start this is about the starting point of the 10 miles of track that were laid the last day, headed up to Promontory. So the Union Pacific Rail Line was taking this route from the east to the west, and they laid about 10 miles of track here. This sign, Historic Railroad Gray, gives us a glimpse of the fact that this road is meant to be the actual road used. Obviously, it was a rail line at the time, and it's turned into a road now. But we're going to follow it to Promontory here for a minute. So right now we're standing at a spot called the Big Fill. You can see behind me there is a stretch of mountainside there. It's kind of hard to see all that clearly, but right between this peak and that one, there was this gully they had to surpass. Obviously, as you can tell from the grade of the road here, it's very, very slightly inclined purposely. You have to maintain a certain grade for it to be viable for a rail line. So they had to fill in the gap made by that gully there. So they ended up pulling in a whole bunch of dirt and rock and stuff and throwing it into this spot there. Blends in real nice these days, but used to stand out real good. Yeah, you can actually take a trail up this way and see it up close, see just how big the Big Fill really is, but kind of a cool spot. All right, so we are here at Promontory Point, or at least the site at which the Golden Spike was driven in. This site was essentially ordered by Congress because, as you can see, there's two rail lines here. One was the Union Pacific coming from the east, started near the Missouri River, and then we have it's represented by one called the Jupiter, but it was owned by a company called the Central Pacific Rail Line, and they came from Sacramento area. So they're coming from the west. Pacific Union, or Union Pacific's coming from the east, and originally they were both being paid by the mile of track that they laid. That ended up a little problematic because when they got around this area, Union Pacific's plan was to keep going into the Nevada desert area, and Central Pacific wanted to keep going into Weber because the more they built, the more they got paid. That's how the funding from the feds worked. But obviously Congress stipulated, said no, we need to have a specified meeting point and put an end to that. So it's going to be Promontory, and this is where it will be. So when the rail lines finally met here, it was at about May 9th of 1869. The project of building this transcontinental rail line was a long time coming. It started clear back in 1847. That's when it was first proposed, at least. And it was pushed for, but it just wasn't the right time. Congress saw the wisdom in it economically, but they just didn't have the feasible materials to make it happen. But eventually Congress did approve it, and the Department of War ended up sending out a commission to conduct an extensive survey of the western land to make sure they could feasibly make this happen. So that survey took place 1853 to 1855. And then we know that by the time 1860-61 comes around, tensions between North and South are boiling over. So obviously it was equally difficult for Congress at the time to choose whether this rail line was going to be in the north or in the south. There was a lot of debate over it, and that's part of the reason why it got delayed for so long. Eventually they settled on a central route. they were thinking about taking one starting in the north area, kind of going through Montana, and they were thinking also of a southern one going much closer to the borderlands between the US and Mexico. But they ended up going with this central route, which starts in Nebraska, somewhere in Nebraska, and ends in Sacramento, California. On the direction of Abraham Lincoln in 1862, the rail line was designated to start in Omaha, Nebraska. So it would officially go Omaha, Nebraska to Sacramento, California. Construction from that point went from 1863 to 1869. As I said before, the companies were paid by the mile, and so both companies kind of made as best use of that as possible. There were actually several instances where they built extraneous lengths of rail to the north and the south just to build on their opportunities to make money out of this endeavor. And there were some other interesting sleight of hand things going on with these companies to really make as much money as possible. But one way or another, they all ended up making it here. Many of the workers that were employed to make this project happen ended up as discharged soldiers from the Civil War, since it's built from 63 to 69. Most of that time is post-Civil War, so we have a lot of people who came home from the war, needed work, and ended up working on this transcontinental rail line. That was predominantly, specifically, the Union Pacific Rail Line coming from the east. The Central Pacific Rail Line from the west was predominantly worked by Chinese immigrants. By the time they met here, there was a very interesting mixture of, we had northerners and southerners coming together in a settlement of community. We also have Chinese immigrants, we had Irish immigrants, and we have a whole bunch of people who came from very different backgrounds, and even those who had prior hostilities during the Civil War came together to make this happen. That's why the building of this transcontinental railroad came more and more to be seen as an effort to stitch the nation back together after the Civil War. As far as Utah is concerned, Brigham Young sought to find some work for his people and also to have an active role in building the rail where he wanted it to be in Utah. So he ended up landing a contract to have 2,000 workers of his own choosing from Utah build the Utah section of the rail line. What's interesting about that is the man who ran Union Pacific, who was the one that he worked with, Durant, he was kind of an underhanded dealer when it came to business. He got caught in a whole bunch of legal hoopla about the things that he was trying to pull with making money and not paying workers. And that really boiled down to the fact that the Utah workers, after all the work they did on this transcontinental railroad, never ended up being compensated for that work. Durant just flat refused to pay them, and the courts never managed to force payment from him on that. So kind of a sad deal there, but nevertheless, the Transcontinental Railroad finds its endpoint in the middle here, where they meet at where they land at the Golden Spike. Golden Spike was a literal spike of gold. It was kind of ceremonial, so it was driven in. There were a few ceremonial spikes driven in at the time. This particular spike was engraved with a sentence that said, "May God continue the unity of our country in this, just as this railroad unites the two great oceans of the world." So that was kind of the hope again, that this was a peaceful resolution to the bloodshed and division of the Civil War. What's crazy about the completion of this project is it turned a 6-month journey from east to west into a week's journey, which completely changes the economic spheres we'll talk about with mining and all of that. But it has a huge impact on the Utah economy for sure. The building of the Transcontinental Railroad in general was a major feat, kind of considered to be the largest version of a pyramid-style build. It was built by hand, headed by 2 railroad companies. Thousands of miles of rail were laid down for this, and ultimately, again, it brought East Coast to West Coast, so it was a very major deal. At the event of the laying of the Golden Spike, it's kind of interesting. The man who was designated to drive the Golden Spike in, according to legend, they have several accounts of the fact that he attempted and failed to do this. He actually had a few of his cohorts attempt as well, and they failed also. But as soon as they asked one of the, I think it was an Irish worker from the Union Pacific line, to step up and do it, he did it, in one shot. And it was kind of this humorous deal. But what else is kind of fascinating about this event is the fact that it was kind of considered the first mass media event ever to take place. The telegraph was this new thing, and they were using it to communicate across the nation about this particular event, and ultimately what they attempted to do was they tried to rig the telegraph line into the hammer and nail so that when that Golden Spike was driven in, it would come across on the telegraph as a ping with each drive that was attempted. Unfortunately, it didn't work out the way they wanted to, so the telegraphman ended up taking over and just hitting it as the drives were made. But at the end of the day, they ended up sending a message saying, done. That was their final message, and as soon as that message was sent, there were bells ringing in churches and people parading in streets, and everyone was celebrating this event, the fact that we were able to fully unite East to West in a very physical, real sense. And we'll talk more about the impact that has on Utah as we talk about Corinne and Ogden.